The Von Drothy Cartography Guild had a saying, older than most spacefaring records the galaxy still bothered to keep: a loud system is alive, a dead system is silent, and a silent system that should be loud is a warning. Sol was the warning. For 311 standard cycles, every scanning array pointed at the ninth spiral arm's inner rim had picked up the same maddening contradiction. The third planet of a modest yellow star showed every mark of a technological civilization: city grid heat signatures across 6 continents, orbital debris fields consistent with centuries of satellite launches, atmospheric carbon signatures that could only come from industrial combustion, and faint, ancient echoes of electromagnetic noise trapped in the interstellar medium like fossils in amber, radiating outward in a sphere roughly 200 light-years wide. And then, abruptly, nothing. Not the nothing of a dead world. Dead worlds had a signature too: the slow cooling of city heat, the eventual silence of failing reactors, the specific spectral rot of a biosphere collapsing without a species to tend it. Sol's third planet did not have that signature. Its cities still glowed with heat. Its atmosphere still bore the telltale chemical fingerprints of industry, agriculture, technology. Something was still there, still building, still living. It had simply stopped talking. To the 31 species of the coalition of bound stars, this was the single most unsettling fact in known space. Every civilization that reached the threshold of interstellar travel did so loudly: radio, then laser communication, then quantum entanglement relays, each louder and more eager than the last, broadcasting their existence to the dark because in the deep hunger of that dark, being known felt like being safe. It was instinct, not choice. Every species did it. The Kethrain did it. The Ossut Concord did it. The Von Drothy, cautious as they were, still did it. The humans had done it too, once. The old broadcasts were still out there, spreading through the void at light speed: fragments of music, fragments of voices, mathematics, the occasional garbled television transmission, a probe called Voyager that had, in its slow tumble through the dark, become something of a religious artifact to at least 4 different species who intercepted its golden record centuries after it left its system. And then, somewhere around what the old broadcasts suggested was the mid-21st century of the human calendar, the noise had simply stopped. Not faded. Not degraded. Stopped, all at once, as if someone had reached out and closed a hand around a candle flame. 311 cycles of silence had followed. 17 probes had been sent to investigate. 4 had gone dark on approach, their last transmissions cutting off mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if something had reached out of the silence and simply erased them. 6 had turned back on their own automated protocols, citing unresolvable telemetry hazards, in reports so heavily redacted by whatever passed for their manufacturer's fear that they were nearly useless. 5 had returned with data so contradictory, gravitational readings suggesting a civilization far more advanced than any inter-system electromagnetic silence should allow, that the coalition's own scientists had argued about them for decades. And 2, only 2, had simply never been heard from again, their fates unknown, their absence a small stone dropped into a very deep well. No living crew had ever gone. The Coalition Council had debated it for longer than some of its member species had existed as unified civilizations, and every single time, the vote had come back the same: not yet. Not without more data. Not without understanding what happened to a species that could build cities and grow crops and apparently keep an entire biosphere humming with technological life, and yet choose, or be forced, to never say another word to the stars. There were 2 theories, and both of them terrified everyone who held a seat on the council. The first theory held that humanity had encountered something. Something that hunted by sound, in the metaphorical sense, something that found civilizations by their noise and silenced them, the way a listening owl finds a mouse by the rustle of grass. If that were true, then Sol's silence was not a message. It was a grave marker, and the electromagnetic signatures the scanning arrays still picked up were the sounds of a slow, terrible ending that had been going on, somehow, for 3 centuries. The second theory was worse. The second theory held that humanity had learned something, and had chosen the silence themselves. That they had looked at whatever waited in the dark, understood it in a way no other species yet had, and made a collective, species-wide decision to vanish rather than be found. If that were true, then the question wasn't what happened to Sol. The question was, what do they know, that we don't? It was the Ilvath diplomatic mission's turn to find out. Sail Threnilith had not wanted this assignment. She said as much, repeatedly, to anyone in the Ilvath Cultural Bridge office who would listen, right up until the moment the assignment stopped being a request and became an order stamped with 3 council seals and a mandatory service clause she could not legally refuse. The Ilvath were not a large species, nor a powerful one, nor, by the standards of most of the 31 coalition members, a particularly important one. They were small, feathered, deeply empathic omnivores from a heavy-gravity world, built low and wide with 4 manipulator limbs and enormous dark eyes adapted for their planet's permanent cloud layer, and their entire cultural export to galactic civilization was diplomacy. Not warships. Not scientific breakthroughs. Not resource wealth. Just an uncanny, near-supernatural talent for reading the emotional undertones of a room and finding the words that de-escalated it. Which was, Sail understood with grim clarity as she boarded the diplomatic vessel. Gentle question, exactly why the Council had chosen the Ilvath for first contact with a species that might be either a graveyard or a predator. If humanity turned out to be dangerous, better to lose an empath than a warship. If humanity turned out to be desperate and traumatized, an empath was the only thing that might get a genuine answer out of them instead of a diplomatic non-response or a weapon. She was 34 years old by Ilvath reckoning, roughly the equivalent of human middle age, she'd later learn, though she didn't know that yet, and she had spent 11 of those years mediating disputes between the Vondrathi Trade Consortium and the Asut mining clans, which she had, until this moment, considered the most stressful work in the galaxy. The gentle question was a small ship. Deliberately small. The Council's mission parameters had been explicit: no weapons, no military escort, no aggressive posture of any kind. If something dangerous waited in Sol, a warship would provoke it. If something traumatized waited in Sol, a warship would terrify it. Either way, the safest thing the Coalition could send was something that looked exactly like what it was: 3 Ilvath diplomats, an Asut linguist named Cravash who had spent 4 decades reconstructing probable human language from the old broadcast fragments, a Vondrathi engineer to keep the ship running, and enough automated recording equipment to document whatever they found for whichever future mission might need to know. They crossed the last 30 light years in silence, the crew's own silence a strange, uncomfortable mirror of the one they were flying toward. "You're anxious," Cravash said, for days out, finding Sail in the observation bay watching the yellow star grow imperceptibly brighter through the forward viewport. The Asut's translation caller rendered his native clicks and subharmonics into passable Ilvath standard, though something in his cadence always sounded slightly off, slightly too careful, like a person reciting words in a language they'd learned from books instead of a mouth. "Everyone is anxious," Sail said. "I'm supposed to be less anxious than everyone else. It isn't working." "For what it's worth," Cravash said, settling his angular frame into the seat beside her, "I don't think it's a predator." "Why not?" "Because predators don't build cities that keep growing." He gestured at the data slate in his claws, where centuries of gravitational and thermal surveys sat compiled into slow, patient graphs. "Whatever's down there has been adding infrastructure at a measurable rate for 300 years. Orbital mass has increased. Thermal output has increased. That's not a species being hunted into extinction. That's a species building something." "Building what?" Cravash didn't answer. Nobody had an answer. That was, after all, the entire reason they were flying toward a star that every scanning array in Coalition space had learned to regard with quiet, superstitious dread. They found the first sign of humanity at the edge of the Kuiper Belt, 41 astronomical units from the yellow star, and it very nearly killed them. The gentle question had been running standard approach protocols, engines at a fraction of capacity, all active sensors dialed down to passive only per the mission's explicit non-threatening posture, when the ship's systems flagged an anomaly. Something had matched their course 4 hours earlier and simply followed, running dark, invisible to every passive sensor the Von Drothy engineer had aboard, until it chose to be seen. It chose to be seen roughly 600 kilometers off their port side, and the manner of its appearing made Sail's hearts. She had too, a trait shared by most Ilveth, stutter in her chest. There was no flash. No drive flare, no gravitational ripple, none of the signatures every coalition vessel left dragging behind it like a wake. One moment the sensor display showed empty space. The next, it showed a vessel, sleek, dark, disquietingly organic in its lines, like something grown rather than built, sitting motionless exactly where a threat assessment would place it for maximum tactical advantage, close enough to intercept, far enough to avoid a snap reaction collision. It had not fired. It had not hailed them. It simply sat there, radiating nothing, no engine heat bleeding into the void, no active scan pinging their hull, nothing but its own bare presence, announced on its own terms, in its own time. That, Cravash said, very quietly, into the ringing silence of the bridge, is not a species that forgot how to talk. That is a species that chose not to be found until it wanted to be found. The Von Drothy engineer, a broad-shouldered creature named Asa Farenthal who had spent 30 years flying supply runs through contested coalition space and considered herself difficult to rattle, was staring at her own instruments with an expression Sail had never seen on a Von Drothy face before. "It was inside our sensor envelope," Asa said. "For 4 hours. We had no idea. Nothing. Not a whisper." Sail made herself breathe, a conscious, deliberate act, the way her training had taught her to do when her own instinctive fear response threatened to leak into whatever she said next, because a diplomat's fear was contagious in ways that mattered. She keyed the comm array, broadcasting on the widest possible band, in the careful, painstakingly reconstructed approximation of human language that Cravash had spent 4 decades assembling from 70-year-old radio fragments. "This is the coalition diplomatic vessel Gentle Question," she said, and heard her own translated voice go out into the dark, rendered by the ship's synthesizer into something that was meant to sound, as closely as 40 years of archaeological linguistics could manage, human. "We come with peaceful intent. We wish to speak with the people of this system. We are unarmed. We mean no harm." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Sail would remember counting every one of them. Then a voice answered, and it was a voice, not a translated approximation, a real recorded human voice, calm and low and entirely unhurried, speaking in accented but clearly practiced coalition standard, which meant, with a chill that ran down Sail's spine, that whoever was on the other end of this transmission had been studying them for far longer than the coalition had been studying Sol. "Copy, Gentle Question. We've had eyes on you since you crossed the outer marker. You're clear to hold position. Do not attempt to advance further into the system without escort." A pause, and something in the voice's cadence shifted, softened, in a way that struck Sail's empathic training like a physical touch. "You're the first ship that's ever asked to talk instead of just trying to run the perimeter. That buys you a lot of patience. Sit tight. Someone's coming to meet you." The line went dead. The dark vessel did not move, did not fire, did not do anything but sit there, patient and silent, for the 11 hours it took for something else to arrive. The escort ship that finally emerged from the dark to guide the Gentle Question inward was, Sail thought, almost deliberately unimpressive, a mid-sized transport, boxy and functional, its hull marked with faded paint and the kind of scuffs and micrometeorite scarring that spoke of decades of real use rather than ceremonial display. It was, in other words, the opposite of every first contact vessel the coalition's own protocols would have specified: no gleaming diplomatic finery, no honor guard, no grandeur. It was, Cravash observed once they'd docked and the airlock cycled open, precisely the kind of vessel you'd send to greet a stranger you didn't yet trust enough to show your good ships to. 3 humans waited for them on the other side of the airlock, and Sail's first true, unfiltered impression, the one that arrived before her diplomatic training could smooth it into something more measured, was simply, they are so still. Not motionless. Not frozen. Simply contained, in a way that felt, to her empathic senses, almost eerie. Every other species she had ever met broadcast some flicker of emotional noise on first contact: curiosity, fear, excitement, something. The three humans standing before her radiated a kind of deliberate, practiced calm that felt less like an absence of feeling and more like a discipline, a skill honed over, she didn't yet know how long, but it felt old, felt inherited, felt like something taught to children before they were old enough to understand why it mattered. The one who stepped forward first was an older woman, silver-haired, dressed in a plain gray uniform with no visible rank insignia beyond a small embroidered symbol Sale didn't recognize, a stylized closed eye over an open one. She looked at each of them in turn, Sale, Cravash, Asa, the two junior Ilvath diplomats trailing behind, with an expression of frank, unhurried assessment, the way one might look at something rare and unexpected that had wandered into a familiar room. "My name is Director Amara Voss," she said, in the same careful, practiced coalition standard the voice on the comm had used. "On behalf of the Terran Concord, welcome. I understand you've been trying to reach us for a very long time." 311 years, Sale said, because it seemed important to say it plainly, and because something in the woman's steady gaze told her plainness would be respected here more than diplomatic softening. We had begun to fear the worst. Something moved behind Director Voss's eyes, not quite a flinch, but close to it, a small crack in that practiced stillness. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry for that. Genuinely. It wasn't cruelty. Come with me. I think it's time someone finally told you why. They were not taken to a city." Sale had expected, hoped for, in some small unprofessional corner of her mind, the chance to see human civilization the way the old broadcasts had promised it, bright, loud, sprawling, cluttered with the particular chaotic beauty of a species that had once filled the electromagnetic spectrum with music and argument and noise. Instead, the transport carried them to a station buried deep in what her sensors identified as the asteroid belt between the fourth and fifth planets, a facility so heavily shielded and so carefully built into the rock itself that it hadn't registered on a single coalition survey in 3 centuries of watching. "This is the Anders Archive," Director Voss said, leading them through corridors lit with the same unhurried, unornamented practicality as everything else about this ship, this station, this species. "Named for the astronomer who first understood what we were looking at. I think it'll answer more questions than I could in a week of talking." The chamber she led them to was circular, its walls given over entirely to display, and as the lights rose, Sale understood, with the particular vertigo of a lifetime's assumptions crumbling at once, that she was looking at a memorial. Star charts, hundreds of them, layered with centuries of annotation. Dates. Names, not human names, Sale realized with a growing chill, but names in a dozen unfamiliar scripts, painstakingly transliterated. And beneath each star system's marker, a single grim notation, repeated with the terrible consistency of a pattern too old to be coincidence: signal ceased. "In the middle of the 21st century, Director Voss said, her voice quiet in the hush of the chamber, we were the loudest thing in this part of the galaxy. Radio, television, deep space probes, the whole chaotic broadcast of a species falling in love with its own voice for the first time. And somewhere in that noise, a very old, very patient astronomer named Dr. Naledi Anders noticed something the rest of us had missed." She gestured, and the display shifted, resolving into a slow, decade-spanning animation, star systems flaring with faint radioactivity, broadcasting outward in expanding spheres, bright with the electromagnetic chatter of civilizations discovering the stars for the first time. And then, one by one, in a pattern too regular to be chance, going dark. She found 41 confirmed instances, Voss continued. 41 civilizations, across 800 years of records inherited from probes and listening arrays we've been quietly running since the mid-20th century, that reached the same threshold we were approaching, visible technological broadcast, expanding outward, growing louder, and then stopped. Not slowly. Not the way a dying civilization goes quiet, fading as its infrastructure fails. All at once. Mid-transmission, in several cases. Anders cross-referenced every one of them against travel time data and found the same signature every time, something crossed into each system roughly 18 months before the silence, moving at speeds our instruments in that era could barely register, and then, nothing. The light stayed on, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. The cities kept their thermal signatures. But the noise stopped. "You are describing a predator," Cravash said, his translation caller rendering the word with careful, clinical precision. "Something that hunts civilizations by their broadcasts. We call them the Hush, in the old records," Boss said. "We don't know what they call themselves. We've never gotten close enough to ask, and every attempt to study them directly has cost us people we couldn't afford to lose. What we do know is this: they don't attack loud civilizations. They silence them." Every single confirmed case, when we finally managed decades later to send our own quiet probes back into those systems, showed the same thing you're seeing in our own system today, from the outside. Populations intact. Infrastructure intact. Cities still humming with heat and light and life. Just, contained. Cut off. Every broadcast array, every satellite relay, every deep space transmitter, disabled or destroyed, and something, we still don't fully understand the mechanism, keeping it that way. 41 civilizations, Ambassador Threnilith, sitting exactly where the Hush left them, alive but silenced, for as long as we've had the instrument sensitive enough to check. Sale's breath had gone shallow. Beside her, she felt Cravash's translation caller stutter mid-render, as if even his species' careful neutrality had briefly failed him. "And you," Sale said slowly, "worked out what was happening in time to stop it happening to you." "We worked out what was happening," Boss said, with about 6 years to spare. Anders published her findings in 2071. It took the world's governments most of that decade to actually believe her, the way it always does. And then it took us another 4 years of the ugliest, most desperate collective argument in human history to agree on what to do about it, because the answer she'd found staring back at her from 41 dead-quiet star systems was so simple it was almost unbearable. "You stopped broadcasting," Sale said. "We didn't just stop," Voss said, and for the first time, something hard entered her voice, not anger, exactly, but the flat, weathered edge of a decision that had cost more than anyone outside this room would ever fully understand. Stopping wasn't enough. Every deep space probe we'd ever launched was still out there, still carrying our location, still broadcasting our specifications into the dark on a 100-year delay we couldn't call back. Every satellite in orbit was still a beacon. So in the space of 11 years, humanity did something no species watching us, including you, apparently, for 300 years, has ever fully understood. We didn't hide because we were weak. We went dark because we had done the math, and the math said that every year we kept broadcasting was another year closer to becoming star system number 42. The chamber's display shifted again, and this time Sale found she had to look away for a moment before she could make herself watch. Archival footage. Real footage, the kind the old broadcasts had never carried this far, restored and compiled from records the humans had apparently kept with the same obsessive, grieving care they'd given everything else in this memorial. Cities at night, blazing with the electric brightness of the broadcast age, slowly, deliberately, going dark, tower by tower, grid by grid, as governments across an entire world coordinated the single largest infrastructure shutdown in the species' history. Crowds, actual crowds of humans, faces Sale's empathic senses could read even through the flattened medium of old recordings, faces caught in grief and fear and a strange, stubborn resolve, gathered in public spaces to watch broadcast towers go dark for what many of them, at the time, believed would be forever. "We lost things," Voss said quietly. "Things you don't get back." An entire generation grew up without global communication networks while we rebuilt everything on hardened, shielded, deliberately short-range infrastructure instead. Families were cut off from each other for years while new systems came online. We recalled every deep space probe transmission array we could reach and detonated the ones we couldn't. We hunted down our own orbital satellites, one by one, and turned an entire era of scientific achievement into scrap, because every single one of them was a lit match in a room we just realized was full of gas. "How did you replace it?" Asa asked, The Vondrathi engineer's voice, when it finally broke the silence, sounded rougher than usual, as if the story had reached something in her that even 3 decades of dangerous supply runs hadn't hardened. A species can't simply stop communicating. You would have collapsed. We built quiet, Voss said. That's the only way I know how to describe 40 years of human engineering, Engineer Ferenthal. Every technology we'd have once broadcast to the stars, we turned inward and buried instead, tight beam, line of sight, physically shielded relays that couldn't leak past a few hundred kilometers. We rebuilt an entire civilization's information infrastructure around the assumption that being heard was a death sentence. It made us slower. It made us paranoid. It made an entire century of human children grow up being taught, from the time they could talk, that the worst thing you could ever do was be loud. She paused, and something in her expression shifted, not softened, exactly, but opened, in a way that sales training recognized as the specific vulnerability of someone finally setting down a weight they'd carried a very long time. And it worked, Voss said. That's the part almost nobody outside this system understands yet, and it's the part one most needs you to carry back to your council. It worked. We went quiet in the 21st century, and the hush never came. Every civilization Anders documented in her original 41 cases went silent within 18 months of a detected incursion. We've had 300 years of quiet, and as far as our own listening arrays can determine, nothing has crossed our border since. We didn't get silenced. We silenced ourselves, on purpose, before anything got the chance to do it for us, and it bought us 3 centuries to prepare for something the rest of the galaxy doesn't even know is out there. Sales sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into her chest with the specific gravity of a fact that was going to reshape the rest of her professional life, and possibly her species' entire understanding of the galaxy around it. Prepare, she said finally. You said it bought you time to prepare. Prepare for what, Director Voss? A war. Eventually, Voss said. But first, something harder. She led them from the memorial chamber into an adjoining hall, and here, for the first time since they'd docked, Sales saw something that looked less like grim discipline and more like the sprawling, chaotic energy the old broadcasts had promised. Screens covered every wall, displaying star charts far more extensive than anything the Coalition's own cartography guilds had ever compiled, annotated not with Coalition data, but with markers Sales slowly recognized as decades of quiet, careful, unauthorized human survey work, extending far beyond Sol's own borders, deep into contested and unclaimed space alike. Anders' original 41 systems weren't just a warning, Voss said. They were a map. Once we understood what the Hush's pattern looked like, we realized we could find more of them, older cases, further out, systems that had gone silent so long ago that even we, with all our new discipline, almost missed the faint thermal echoes of civilization still technically alive under that silence. We started sending our own quiet ships. Not to make contact, contact was still exactly what had gotten those species silenced in the first place. Just to watch. To learn everything we could about how the Hush operated, how long they stayed, what they left behind, whether the silenced worlds were truly beyond help. And were they? Sale asked, though some instinct in her already suspected the answer, because nothing about this species' 3 centuries of grim, patient discipline suggested they were the kind of people who watched suffering without eventually acting on it. Voss's mouth curved, not quite into a smile, something older and more complicated than that. Come and see. The next room was smaller, more crowded, and unmistakably a working operations center rather than a memorial, humans moving between stations with the same unhurried, practiced calm Sale had noted from the moment they'd boarded, monitoring displays that tracked. She slowly realized with a fresh jolt of vertigo, dozens of star systems far beyond Sol's own borders. Species designation Cathalo, said a young man at the nearest station, not looking up from his display as they approached, apparently already briefed on their arrival and the reason for it. Silenced approximately 400 years ago, by our best estimate. We made contact 11 years ago. Quietly. He glanced up then, and Sale caught, for just a moment, something bright and fierce beneath his own carefully trained stillness, pride, unmistakable, warm and human in a way none of the last hour's grim history had prepared her for. Population had survived the initial silencing more or less intact, same as every case we've studied. The hush doesn't kill outright, near as we can tell, they just cut. Contain. Leave a species alive but cut off, like a hand isolated from its nervous system. Cthulhu had spent 4 centuries with no external contact of any kind, believing themselves entirely alone in the universe. Traumatized. Terrified of their own sky. What did you do? Sale asked, though her voice had gone very quiet. We taught them to be quiet like us, first, the young man said. That took the better part of a decade. You can't just hand a traumatized species faster-than-light technology and tell them to run. They'll broadcast out of sheer relief the first chance they get and undo 400 years of surviving in an afternoon. So we went slow. Established trust. Shared what Anders learned, and what 3 centuries of our own study had added to it. Helped them rebuild their own infrastructure the way we'd rebuilt ours, quiet, shielded, deliberate. His pride sharpened into something harder, more determined. They're spacefaring again now. Still cautious. Still learning. But they know they're not alone anymore, and more importantly, they know why they were silenced, which is more than any of the original 41 civilizations ever got to learn on their own. How many? Cravash asked, and something in the careful precision of his translated voice suggested he already suspected the scale of the answer and dreaded it anyway. How many species have you found? Silenced. How many have you reached? Director Voss answered this one herself. We've located 63 silenced systems in 3 centuries of quiet searching, across a radius the Coalition's own surveys haven't come close to covering, because you've all been busy being loud and we've spent 300 years specifically getting very, very good at not being seen while we look. Of those 63, we've made contact with 22. Fully reintegrated 11 into a quiet, careful mutual defense network we've been building, species who know now what the hush is, who've learned to survive under its notice the way we did, who are, frankly, Ambassador, very possibly the reason your own coalition hasn't been found yet either. Because a fair few of those quiet allied systems sit rather precisely along routes that would otherwise lead directly toward the sort of loud, broadcasting civilization the hush has always shown a preference for hunting. The room went very still. You have been protecting us, Sale said slowly, the shape of the last 3 centuries rearranging itself in her mind with the vertiginous speed of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The Coalition. All 31 of us. We assumed Sol's silence was a mystery to be solved from a safe distance. You are telling me it has been a shield. Not on purpose, at first, Voss admitted. In the beginning we were only trying to survive. But once we understood how far the hush's hunting range extended, and once we found other silenced systems close enough to your own coalition's territory to map the overlap, yes. For the last 130 years, a great deal of what we've built has been specifically about making sure nothing loud enough to draw the hush's attention gets close enough to your worlds to matter. We couldn't warn you without breaking our own silence in a way that might have unraveled everything. So we watched. And we waited for someone from your side to be brave enough, or desperate enough, or simply kind enough, to come and ask instead of just running the perimeter and going home. Her eyes found Sale's, steady and unhurried. You're the first ones who asked. They stayed in the Anders archive for 6 more days, 6 days that Sale would spend the rest of her career trying, and largely failing, to compress into any report the Coalition Council would find adequate to the scale of what she'd witnessed. She saw the quiet fleet, dozens of vessels built along the same disquieting, dark, almost organic lines as the one that had shadowed the Gentle Question for 4 unnoticed hours at the system's edge, ships built from the ground up around a single design principle no coalition engineer had ever prioritized, the capacity to be, when necessary, absolutely and perfectly silent. She met Cthulhu diplomats, tall, chitinous, still faintly wary of open sky after 4 centuries of learned fear, but unmistakably, cautiously hopeful in a way that struck Sale's empathic senses like sunlight after a long gray season. She saw children, actual human children, born and raised entirely within the era of the Great Silence, who had never known a broadcasting world and who regarded the coalition delegation's own comparatively loud, careless ship with the same fascinated, faintly alarmed curiosity a coastal child might show a stranger who'd never learned to fear the tide. And on the sixth day, Director Voss brought her, alone this time, to a small observation room overlooking nothing in particular, just the slow wheel of stars beyond a reinforced viewport, the same stars Sale had grown up trusting to be, at worst, indifferent. "I'm not going to pretend this is a small thing I'm about to ask of you," Voss said. "Your coalition is loud, Ambassador. 31 species, a few centuries of comfortable expansion, broadcast networks running across half the quadrant without a second thought, and until 311 years of a very unsettling silence finally worried you enough to send someone to ask why, no real understanding that any of it might be dangerous. What we're offering isn't just an alliance. It's a way of living we spent a century learning at a cost I don't think I could fully explain to you even if I had another 6 days to try. Quiet doesn't come naturally to a species that's never needed it. It's going to cost your people things they don't yet know they're going to miss. And the alternative," Sale said, "is remaining loud, and hoping the hush's attention continues to overlook us the way it apparently has for 3 centuries, purely because a species we didn't know existed has been quietly standing guard on our behalf without our knowledge or consent. That's about the shape of it, yes." Sale looked out at the stars, the same stars, she realized, that every silenced civilization in that memorial chamber had once looked at with the same unthinking, trusting confidence her own species had always carried into the dark, and felt something in her settle, quietly and completely, into a decision. "I came here afraid of your silence," she said. "I think every species in the coalition has spent 3 centuries afraid of it, in one way or another. We built theories. We built superstitions. We built an entire diplomatic protocol around the assumption that whatever waited at the end of it would either be a grave or a threat." She turned to face Director Voss fully. "I did not build a theory that accounted for the truth. That your silence was never a wound, or a warning aimed at us. It was a shield, held up for 300 years, at a cost your species is still quietly paying, on behalf of neighbors who didn't even know you existed. It wasn't purely selfless," Voss said, with the faint, weathered honesty of someone who'd clearly had this exact conversation, in one form or another, with every species they'd ever finally revealed themselves to. "We wanted to survive. We still do. But somewhere in 300 years of surviving quietly, we also worked out that surviving alone isn't really surviving at all, not in any way that means much. We started reaching outward again the moment we had something real to offer instead of just a fresh reason to be found. Then let me be the first to say it properly," Sale said, and found, to her own faint surprise, that her voice held steady. "On behalf of the Ilvith Cultural Bridge Office, and pending, I will admit, at considerable length and with no small amount of argument, ratification by a coalition council that has spent 3 centuries being afraid of exactly the wrong thing, we would be honored to learn how to be quiet. Whatever it costs." Director Voss studied her for a long moment, and this time, when something moved behind her carefully practiced stillness, it was, unmistakably, something like relief. "Good," she said. "Because there's one more thing you should probably know before you take that back to your council, Ambassador. We've spent 300 years learning to survive the hush by disappearing from their notice entirely. We've spent the last 50 specifically studying them, quietly, patiently, from just far enough outside their range to stay safe while we learned everything we could about what they are, how they hunt, and, we think, though we're not yet certain, how they might eventually be stopped for good." Her eyes went to the wheeling stars beyond the viewport, and something in her expression hardened into the particular resolve of a species that had spent 3 centuries turning grief into discipline and discipline, patiently, into purpose. "We didn't go quiet because we were afraid forever, Ambassador Threnilith. We went quiet because we intend to be the last thing the hush ever hunts." The Coalition Council's ratification debate lasted, in the end, for years, shorter, by a considerable margin, than the 11-year argument humanity had once needed to agree on its own silence, and Sale Threnilith would later reflect, with the particular dry humor she'd picked up from an unlikely number of human counterparts in the years that followed, that this at least suggested the galaxy was capable of learning something. The story spread slowly, the way all true things did in a galaxy that had, until recently, valued loudness over patience. It spread through the coalition's 31-member species not as a broadcast. Humanity had, gently but firmly, insisted on that, but the old way, the quiet way, person to person, world to world, carried by the kind of careful, deliberate diplomacy the Ilvith had always specialized in and had finally, after 3 centuries, found a use worthy of the name. Every species feared the silence of Earth. Until they learned it wasn't silence at all. It was a species holding its breath, patiently, deliberately, for 300 years, not because it had nothing left to say, but because it had understood, long before anyone else in the dark around it, that survival sometimes looks exactly like disappearing, and that the bravest thing a civilization can do, when it finally finds something worth protecting, is learn to disappear on purpose, and keep watch anyway. Subscribe and tell the method is good or nor please comment your comment decide which I do work.